for the sake of a better term, I went on a fishing trip this week, and I found some interesting things that are very, very helpful, I think, to each and every one of us. I started in the book of Matthew, chapter 12, verse 28. And this is the portion of Scripture that gives the greatest commandment. I read it over and over and over again, and I started looking for information to sort of shed more light and to help understand it better. And I didn't really find all that much help. When I taught a Sunday school class at Aldersgate, we had quarterlies, and then also to go along with that, we had this big, thick book. It was the universal lesson, or like for all throughout Christianity. And they would go in a little bit deeper on what the quarterly said. And the way that was set up, every 3 years, or for a period of 3 years, they would sort of bring out the highlights of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so after, it was on a 3-year cycle. It would rotate out, and then it would sort of go back over the same passages, the same verses, and somebody else would come at it from a different approach. And so I looked through all of those books. I had a whole great big stack of those universal lessons for these verses. Let me read Mark chapter 12, verse 28. It says, one of the teachers, and this is out of the NIV, one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, of all the commandments, which is the most important? And then Jesus gives the answer. The setting here is this. Some Sadducees had been asking Jesus questions. The Sadducees was a sect, and we used to say they were sad, you see, because they didn't believe in the resurrection. But anyway, that's how I sort of remember about the Sadducees. But anyway, the Sadducees was asking Jesus questions. And for the most part, they was asking questions, trying to stump him so that they would have something to use against him. So it starts out in verse 28 there, one of the teachers, and a lot of versions say one of the scribes, or they was actually Pharisees, who was the experts in the law, in the Mosaic law. And so this scribe or Pharisee overheard the Sadducees and Jesus' conversation. And paraphrasing it, I think he probably said to himself, well, I have a question that I'm going to ask Jesus. But the thing about this question was, it was a really hot topic question. And so his question was, starting out at verse 28. He asked him, of all the commandments, which is the most important one out of all the commandments? The rabbinical law that a lot of them used, they sort of divided things up in either weighty, like heavy, weighty, W-I-G-H-T-Y, or light. And rabbinical law, they had 613 precepts of the law, 248 commands, and 365 prohibitions. I think I am good with just the 10 Commandments myself, but anyway, that's just a personal choice. But anyway, this Pharisee asked Jesus the question, And to me, I think out of this passage, and I thought, as I was digging around and scratching around, I thought, this is talking about the greatest commandment. So why wasn't there, in all of those teachings and all those passages of scriptures, since this is the greatest commandment, why wasn't there more on this? So that made me want to keep on digging a little bit further. But verse 29, this is Jesus answering the teacher or the expert, the Pharisee. This is his answer. The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, and the Lord is one. Hear or listen, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then he goes ahead and gives to love the Lord with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and so on. But anyway, that opening line, part of his answer that he gave. What I'd done was I went back, my second-year Greek teacher, Mark only has 16 chapters to it, and Dr. Piccarilli wrote a commentary about, I was going to measure it to be exact, about 1.5 inches thick on the book of Mark. And I thought, how in the world did he have a book this thick just explaining in detail the book of Mark? Well, he's still living, but he's a Greek New Testament scholar, taught for 60 years. But anyway, I thought, well, I'll see what Dr. Pick has to say about these very important verses, the greatest commandment. So the part where it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The way he said it was, the Hear, O Israel, hear is the same for listen. So listen, O Israel. And the way he said it was, Yahweh, our God, is one Yahweh. Yahweh, our God, is one Yahweh. Now, the culture at that time, they was engulfed in many, many gods, small g, and goddesses. So I'm sure that this is the reason for it to be answered this way. Yahweh, our God, Yahweh is one. I got also, and I won't ask them up in the top to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 6. And it's really, really important because whenever Jesus answered this Pharisee the way he did, Jesus was quoting Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 and 5. And I'm going to take a minute and find that in my thing. Okay, Deuteronomy chapter 6, starting at verse 4. So Jesus quoted that in Mark chapter 12, verse 28 and 29. Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy to answer the Pharisees' question about what is the greatest commandment. Let me read Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, or listen, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. And when I was reading this, I thought, I'm sure that my mom had to have read this along the way. Because verse 7 starts out, impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home like at the supper table. And when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up, tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and your gates. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then I went to another spot, and this was really, really wonderful find for me. I thought, well, somebody gave me a Jewish study Bible. I'm not sure exactly where I got it, but I thought I'll just look in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4, 5, and 6, see if I can find anything else on this, since it is the greatest of all the commandments. So I looked in that and found out that Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, listen to this. Sorry about that, I'm on the wrong page now. Okay, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, out of the Jewish Study Bible. The Shema, and Siri, did any of you consult Siri any along the way during the week? Siri helped me to maybe say that S-H-E-M-A properly. She said just Shema. But anyway, Shema, and this was really interesting, is the core and foundation of Israel's faith. It is the most important of all Jewish prayers. During the Second Temple period, the Shema rose to prominence in the synagogue worship and remains central to this day. They use the word Adonai. He will be declared now and into the future as the one true God. As it is written on that day, Adonai will be the only one with a capital 0. And his name will be the only one with a capital 0, according to Zechariah 14:9. And then it went on to say, you are to love Adonai, ours is Lord, and then the Hebrews, Yahweh. You are to love Adonai, your God, with all your heart, because the covenant is based on a relationship with Adonai. Israel is instructed to perform the Lord's commandments in love. According to Israel's sages, the one who acts out of love cannot be compared to the one who acts out of fear. With all your heart means that one's love for God should be wholehearted and single-minded. So when Jesus answered the scribe and he said, "Hear, O Israel," he was quoting Deuteronomy chapter 6. Remember, Moses, first of all, Deuteronomy is a prayer. It's just one big long prayer, probably the longest, it's one big long sermon, probably the longest sermon that has ever been preached. And Moses, when he got done preaching this sermon, he went up and died. He was on the plains of Moab, and this is where this took place. But Jesus quoted Moses' Deuteronomy chapter 6. And the really neat thing about this to me is, and this whole thing I thought about most of the day yesterday, our coming to church, our reading our Bibles, our praying, everything that we do as a Christian, according to this, should be done out of love for God. Now, I had a hard time with that growing up as a kid, and I'm sure I've mentioned it before, I had the idea, because Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night revivals, camp meetings, if there's anything going on, we was always there, and most of the time I went, even though I wanted to play basketball in the winter or baseball in the summer, but I went anyway because I had to. But I sort of got the idea and the concept. It was like God was up there with this big stick and looking down, and the first time I got out of hand, it was bam, and he'd get me back in line. I think I really, love it just somehow didn't really fit, because I thought it was because I had to and out of obligation. So the really neat part about this is I can come at it from a totally different point of view and say the reason why I'm doing this or doing that or going there or everything that I do needs to be out of my love for God. I found a few interesting things about love for God. I'll read them real quickly. First of all, I found out that went along with this, it is our highest duty as a Christian. Love for God. Love for God rests on the truth that there is only one God. Love for God is basic to all other responsibilities. It comes first and puts everything else in its place. Love for God must be from our whole being. And the wording in that I found a really interesting point about loving God, and the part where love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and spirit. It is out of our whole heart, out of our whole mind, W-H-O-L-E, out of our whole strength. That is the way that we're to love Him. Love for God must be from our whole being. This kind of love leads to appropriate love for others. Love for God is more important, and this was a stinger, if you would. Love for God is more important and pleasing to Him than any amount of ritual and ceremony, including sacrifices. And that one verse, verse 31, speaks to that. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. No commandment greater than these. Love for God is the nature of those in the kingdom of God. There's a question in that second part of that verse, actually verse 31. He asked which was the greatest commandment, and he gave that, and it says the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then the question is posed, who is our neighbor? Who is our neighbor? The Greek word for neighbor is plesion, P-L-E-S-I-O-N. And it means one close by or near at hand. That's our neighbor. In practice, it means anyone you can reach out to, relate to, or have contact with. In other words, anyone and everyone that we can be involved with falls under the description of who our neighbor is. It says the second is to love our neighbor as ourselves. The greatest commandment is love. There's a whole lot of things that run through my mind And in one place I read, it says, all of the law and all of the prophets hangs on these two commandments. And it talked about in there how, as far as God is concerned, no amount of sacrifices and ritual and all the things that we do, that is all secondary to loving Him with all of our heart, soul, mind. Let me just read that verse. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts, and impress them on your children, and on it goes. But loving God with our whole heart. And one key factor is this. When that starts out, hear, O Israel, or listen, O Israel. Adonai, our God. Adonai is the only one, or Yahweh, our God. He's the only God. So, we are to be devoted. We are to be devoted to Him and to Him only. But that's really, it's a positive thing. To me, this whole thing was very, very positive. It helps me redirect and change my whole attitude about a lot of different things. The motive, when I'm asked, or the motive, is because I love God. Not that I want to miss hell, not that I want to do, all this other stuff. It should be for love for God. I do many, many things for Reba because she's my wife and I love her, not because I have to. I do as much as I possibly can do for our grandkids because I love them. And I know I've told you, I tell them I love them worse than a hog loves slop, and they say that's gross and so on and so forth, and then we move on. But anyway, I do. It's because I love them. A lot of things as a teenager I didn't do and wouldn't go because I knew that if Mom found out, it would hurt her. And so I didn't do it. I didn't want to hurt her. This is the principle here. And it's good. It's positive. It's upbeat. It's a great way to start out a little bit into 2020. Loving God is the most important thing that we could possibly be doing. And all of this other stuff, it's going to fall into place. It makes it's a whole lot more fun and more enjoyable if we go and we do it with the right motive, because we love God. It's a whole lot easier to do it. Verse 31, the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater. Now, we already know the other passages that say, if you don't love your brother down here, whom you have seen, then there's a little thing that goes along with that. How can you possibly say that you love God if you don't love whom you haven't seen, if you don't love your brother or sister down here? So it's love. That is the reason. That is the motive. If you get a chance, well, in the book of Luke, the question was asked in a different way, and the answer was the parable of the Good Samaritan. There's a lot of different ways to approach this, but the main thing is to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, spirit, strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. And our life will be much different. I think it'll be much more enjoyable instead of doing things out of drudgery. Any of you do anything out of drudgery? It's not really too much fun when it's out of drudgery, and it's a whole lot much more fun if we're doing it for the right reason, out of love. Stand with me if you will.